Unbreakable bond. Ranger's moment of truth. Can a dog's instinct save a room full of people when no one believes? The answer hung in the balance as the scent of danger filled the air, detectable only by one pair of nostrils in the crowded courtroom. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, pressing down on Mason's chest like a physical weight. The silence amplified his racing heartbeat as every eye in the room focused on him. A decorated sergeant confined to a wheelchair, dressed in a crisp military uniform, with medals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Mason's fingers tightened around the leather leash, connecting him to Ranger, the German shepherd sitting vigilantly beside him. Ranger wasn't just alert, he was intensely present. His ears stood at attention, dark eyes scanning the room methodically, his posture communicating a readiness that only Mason truly understood. To everyone else, Ranger might have appeared to be just another military working dog, but to Mason, he was salvation embodied in fur and loyalty. Judge Hoffman cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence. "Sergeant Cooper, I need to remind you that this hearing represents your final opportunity to present your case." His voice echoed against the wood-paneled walls. "The Army maintains that 9 Ranger will be reassigned according to protocol. As government property, his services are required elsewhere." Government property. The phrase burned in Mason's ears like acid. After everything they'd survived together, after the countless times Ranger had dragged him from danger, detected hidden explosives, and later, when home felt more foreign than the battlefield, given him a reason to wake up each morning, he was being reduced to inventory. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the leash. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Your Honor," he began, his voice roughened by emotion but gaining strength with each word. "Ranger represents far more than military equipment. He saved my life repeatedly in ways that cannot be quantified in reports or understood by those who weren't there." Mason's throat tightened, but he pressed on. "In Kandahar, he pulled me from a collapsed building after an IE detonation. In Mosul, he detected a tripwire that would have killed my entire unit. He took a bullet meant for me during an ambush, never faltering in his duty." Mason paused, the memories flooding back with visceral intensity. He could still feel the desert heat, the weight of his gear, the pulse of adrenaline, and always, Ranger's unwavering presence beside him. "When I returned home," Mason continued, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in, "I couldn't look in the mirror. The man who stared back was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with surgery or physical therapy. Ranger was the only one who could reach me in that darkness. He woke me from nightmares, stayed by my side during panic attacks, and gave me purpose when I couldn't find my own. Please," Mason's voice cracked, raw emotion bleeding through, "don't take him from me." The courtroom remained still, the air thick with unspoken sympathy. Mason caught glimpses of audience members dabbing at tears, others exchanging looks that mingled pity with indignation. Judge Hoffman's expression remained carefully neutral as he studied Mason. Then Ranger, then back to Mason. The judge leaned forward, preparing to deliver his verdict. But before Judge Hoffman could speak, something unexpected happened. Ranger abruptly stood, muscles tensing as he yanked the leash from Mason's trembling hands. The German shepherd moved purposefully toward the judge's bench, his sudden barking reverberating throughout the courtroom like a warning siren. Gasps erupted from the spectators. Yet, despite the commotion, Mason recognized something critical about Ranger's behavior. There was no aggression in his stance, no threat in his movements. His barking had the distinct cadence and pitch that Mason had learned to recognize from countless missions. It was purposeful. Urgent communication. "Ranger," Mason called out, his voice sharp with concern. But even as panic fluttered in his chest, A deeper understanding dawned. This wasn't random behavior or bad timing. This was Ranger doing what he'd been trained to do, what had kept them both alive for years. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, rippling through the gallery like waves. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone murmured anxiously from the back row. Mason's pulse quickened as he wheeled himself forward. "He never barks without cause," he explained, his voice trembling but gaining conviction. "This is his warning signal. He's detecting something dangerous, something none of us can see." Judge Hoffman froze, gavel suspended in midair, his eyes locked on Ranger. The room fell into a hush, disturbed only by Ranger's persistent barking that echoed like a determined heartbeat. For the first time since the hearing began, Mason felt something besides despair. Whatever Ranger had sensed, it transcended their personal struggle. The dog knew something that no one else in the room could perceive, and in that realization, Mason found a strange glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about saying goodbye. Something else was unfolding. Ranger's posture shifted lower, ears pinned back against his skull, eyes fixed unwaveringly on the judge's bench. Mason gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, recognizing the stance immediately from their time in combat zones. This wasn't random behavior. This was Ranger's detection posture, the position he took when he'd identified a threat that required immediate attention. "Ranger Mason!" called out, his voice firm yet laced with uneasiness. Ranger glanced back momentarily, his intelligent eyes connecting with Mason's in silent communication, before returning his attention to the perceived threat. This brief exchange spoke volumes to Mason. Ranger was signaling that he had the situation under control, that he knew exactly what he was doing. Without hesitation, the German Shepherd moved forward with measured steps toward the judge's bench. His barking gave way to a deep, resonant growl that sent visible shivers through the assembled crowd. The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed dramatically. The sympathy previously directed toward Mason now morphed into palpable anxiety. The audience members began to whisper nervously among themselves, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others casting worried glances toward the exits. "Mr. Cooper," Judge Hoffman said, his tone carrying a sharp edge of annoyance, "control your dog, or I will have to." "With respect, Your Honor," Mason interrupted, his voice rising with urgency. "Ranger isn't misbehaving. He's meticulously trained to detect threats, explosives, chemical agents, weapons, anything that poses danger. He wouldn't exhibit this behavior unless he sensed a legitimate threat." A heavy silence descended upon the courtroom as Mason's words sank in. The initial skepticism visible on many faces gradually transformed into a dawning unease. The concept that the dog might be detecting an actual threat began to take root, spreading through the crowd like a contagion of fear. Before anyone could respond, Ranger suddenly ceased barking. The abrupt silence was almost more unnerving than the noise had been. Ranger's body went completely rigid, his head swiveling sharply toward the back of the courtroom. His ears stood perfectly erect, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from deep within his chest, more threatening than his barking had been. The change was so dramatic and instantaneous that even Judge Hoffman remained frozen, all thoughts of maintaining order temporarily abandoned. Every person in the courtroom instinctively followed Ranger's gaze toward the heavy wooden door at the room's entrance. A collective tension rippled through the gallery as people began to register that whatever Ranger had detected, it was now focused at the courtroom's entrance. The whispers grew more urgent, morphing into concerned murmurs that carried notes of rising panic. Mason's breathing quickened as he too stared at the door, his military training kicking in despite the years that had passed. His pulse hammered against his ribs, echoing in his ears. He had witnessed this exact behavior from Ranger countless times in Afghanistan and Iraq, moments before the dog had uncovered a carefully concealed explosive device or alerted them to an impending ambush. "Ranger," Mason whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing tension. "What is it, boy?" Ranger remained motionless except for the slow, deliberate rise and fall of his chest, his growl deepening into a continuous vibration that seemed to reverberate through the very air of the courtroom. Whatever he had discovered was no longer a potential concern. It had crystallized into a definite threat, not just to Mason but potentially to everyone present. The growl intensified, rumbling through the courtroom like distant thunder. It froze everyone in place, creating a tableau of suspended animation. Judge Hoffman, who had been prepared to silence Mason moments before, now looked visibly unsettled, exchanging anxious glances with the court officers while still clutching his gavel in a white-knuckled grip. The electric tension in the air was palpable, like the charged atmosphere before a violent storm. Mason's breathing grew shallow and rapid, his hands gripping the wheelchair armrests with such force that his knuckles blanched. He had experienced this too many times not to recognize the gravity of Ranger's warning. During their deployments, Ranger's instincts had repeatedly drawn the line between survival and disaster, and Mason had learned to trust those instincts implicitly. "Stay calm," Mason muttered under his breath, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Despite all his combat experience, despite having faced death alongside Ranger more times than he cared to remember, he found himself unsure how to proceed in this civilian environment, where most people couldn't comprehend the significance of what was unfolding. Officer Dawson, a burly man with a perpetual frown who had been standing near the judge's bench, finally stepped forward. His hand instinctively moved to rest on the weapon holstered at his hip, his expression betraying a mixture of skepticism and nascent concern. "It's just a dog, right?" Dawson questioned, though his uncertain tone revealed his own doubt. Dawson questioned, though his uncertain tone revealed his own doubt. Probably just reacting to all the noise and unfamiliar faces. Even as he spoke, however, his movements remained cautious, each step measured and deliberate, the careful advance of someone who wasn't entirely convinced by his own dismissal. Mason shook his head firmly, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry through the uneasy murmurs filling the room. "No, officer. Ranger doesn't react to crowds or noise. He's specifically trained not to. When he behaves like this, it means he's detected something concrete that poses a threat. I've seen this exact behavior in war zones. Trust me, there's a legitimate reason behind his warning." His words hung in the air for several long seconds, their weight settling over the courtroom like a shroud. Finally, Judge Hoffman, looking visibly troubled, nodded toward Officer Dawson and his partner, Officer Chen, signaling them to investigate. Ranger's growls escalated in volume and intensity as the officers approached the courtroom door. Officer Dawson reached out with a hesitant hand to grasp the metal handle, while Officer Chen positioned herself strategically, her hand also hovering near her weapon. For a single breathless moment, the entire room seemed suspended in time. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched, muscles coiled with anticipation despite being seated. Ranger remained in a perfect stance of alertness, every fiber of his being focused on what lay beyond that door. The doorknob turned with an audible click, and the heavy wooden door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit corridor. At first glance, the hallway appeared empty, just shadows and the faint glow of emergency exit signs in the distance. Yet Ranger's reaction intensified dramatically. His barking took on a sharper, more urgent quality, his focus locked on something apparently invisible to everyone else. Officer Dawson stepped cautiously into the hallway, one hand still on his weapon. He glanced back toward the courtroom, his expression difficult to read in the half-light, before turning his attention back to the corridor. After several tense seconds, his voice broke the silence. "There's something here." The words were simple, but delivered with such grave certainty that Mason felt his chest tighten with dread. Whatever Officer Dawson had noticed had validated Ranger's instincts, confirming what Mason already knew with bone-deep certainty. Ranger was never wrong about these things. The dog's ability to detect threats had been honed through rigorous training and battlefield experience, and when it came to identifying danger, his accuracy was unparalleled. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly oppressive, as if the very air had become dense with fear and anticipation. Ranger's barking continued, sharp and insistent, each bark like the strike of a hammer against the mounting tension. Officer Dawson took another tentative step into the hallway, the sound of his boots on the tiled floor unnaturally loud in the strained silence. His hand now rested directly on his holstered weapon, his entire demeanor suggesting he expected something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "What's happening out there?" Judge Hoffman demanded, his judicial authority momentarily reasserting itself, though his voice betrayed his growing apprehension. His knuckles had turned white from his grip on the gavel, his eyes darting between the open doorway and Ranger's tense form. A low, ominous rumble shook through the courtroom, sending visible shivers through the assembled crowd. Officer Dawson turned back toward the room, his face ashen with uncertainty. "I don't see anything specific," he reported hesitantly, each word carefully chosen. "But something feels wrong. It's too quiet, too still." His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, yet in the silent courtroom it carried with crystal clarity. Mason leaned forward in his wheelchair, stomach knotting with a familiar sense of impending threat. He had heard similar assessments countless times during his military service, and they invariably presaged disaster. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as instincts long honed in combat zones screamed warnings in his mind. "Ranger doesn't react to nothing," Mason stated firmly, his voice cutting through the anxious murmurs rippling through the crowd. "If he's behaving this way, there's a concrete reason. We need to evacuate. Now." The command in his tone was unmistakable, a reflex from years of leadership in crisis situations. Yet the audience remained frozen, paralyzed by confusion, and the human tenet becomes undeniable until it becomes undeniable. Officer Chen stepped forward, unclipping a tactical flashlight from her belt. The powerful beam cut through the hallway's gloom, illuminating sections of polished floor, institutional wall paint, and little else of significance. "I don't see anything unusual," she reported, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just an empty corridor." But Ranger's state was anything but calm. His growls continued to build in intensity, his barking becoming more friendly. He strained against his leash with such force that Mason had to grip it with both hands to maintain control. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound echoed from somewhere down the hallway, a distinct clang that cut through the silence like a knife. Officer Chen jerked her flashlight toward the source of the noise, instinctively stepping backward. Ranger lunged toward the sound, barking with such ferocity that his claws scraped against the courtroom floor. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and the first real signs of panic began to manifest among the spectators. Some half rose from their seats. Others clutched their belongings tighter, eyes fixed on the open doorway. Officer Dawson drew his weapon with fluid efficiency, his voice tight with tension. What the hell was that? Mason's heart pounded painfully against his ribs. He raised his voice above the growing chaos, called for backup. Whatever Ranger's sensing, it's moving closer. Another metallic sound echoed through the hallway, louder this time, followed by what sounded distinctly like a footstep. The atmosphere crackled with dread as Ranger barked more desperately, as if trying to warn everyone through sheer volume and intensity. Mason clung to the leash, pulse racing as every combat instinct he possessed screamed alerts in his mind. Whatever was happening transcended the hearing about Ranger's reassignment. Something dangerous was unfolding, and Ranger had sensed it long before anyone else. Officers Chen and Dawson moved cautiously into the hallway, weapons drawn, flashlight beams cutting through the shadows. Officer Chen's light trembled slightly, creating dancing patterns on the walls and floor that revealed nothing concrete but somehow made the darkness seem more threatening. "Do you see anything?" Judge Hoffman called out, his voice cracking under the strain. He had risen from his seat, the gavel clutched in his trembling hand like a talisman. Officer Dawson glanced back, his face pale and sheened with nervous sweat. "Nothing definitive," he replied, voice low and tense, as though speaking too loudly might provoke whatever presence lurked ahead. He took another step forward, his boot heels clicking ominously against the floor. The spectators in the courtroom had begun to murmur more urgently, some edging toward the secondary exit at the room's side, others frozen in their seats. The collective anxiety was almost tangible, spreading like a contagion through the space. Mason rolled his wheelchair slightly forward, gaze locked on Ranger. The German shepherd had gone eerily silent again, ears stiffly erect, body absolutely still, eyes fixed unwavering on the open doorway. This sudden silence was more alarming than his previous barking, a sign that the perceived threat had become immediate. "He sees something," Mason said quietly, the certainty in his voice cutting through the room's nervous energy. "I don't know what it is, but Ranger's detected a specific threat. His posture is unmistakable." Just as the words left his mouth, a shadow shifted in the hallway, so quick and subtle that it might have been dismissed as imagination, except that Officer Chen gasped audibly, her flashlight jerking toward the movement. Officer Dawson froze, weapon aimed steadily into the darkness. Ranger barked again, a single sharp sound that nearly tore the leash from Mason's grip. "Get out of there!" Mason shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom with commanding urgency. Judge Hoffman banged his gavel repeatedly, a futile attempt to restore order as chaos began to consume the room. People stood from their seats, their anxious whispers escalating into frightened exclamations. Some were already moving toward the exits in hurried, barely controlled movements. Then, cutting through the mounting disorder, came the unmistakable sound of deliberate footsteps from within the hallway, slow, measured, almost theatrical in their pacing. Ranger's bark transformed into a low, threatening growl, his teeth bared, body braced as if preparing for confrontation. Fear cascaded through Mason's body, a cold wave that was painfully familiar from combat situations. Whatever entity was approaching, it wasn't attempting to hide or flee. It was deliberately advancing, wanting to be detected. Each footstep reverberated through Mason's consciousness with the inevitability of a countdown, creating a palpable rhythm of approaching danger. Ranger's growl intensified, the sound vibrating through the air with primal warning. The German shepherd pulled against his leash with such determination that Mason's wheelchair rolled forward several inches before he could brace it. "Everyone remain calm," Judge Hoffman shouted, striking his gavel once more in a desperate bid for control. But his words fell on deaf ears, as panic had already taken firm hold of the gallery. People scrambled from their seats, gathering belongings and moving toward exits with increasing urgency. Officer Dawson maintained his position in the hallway, weapon raised, while Officer Chen hovered nearby, her flashlight beams sweeping frantically across the corridor's length. Despite their training and equipment, they had yet to identify what had triggered Ranger's reaction. "Get out of there now!" Mason shouted again, his words razor-sharp with urgency. Yet Officer Dawson remained, jaw set with determination as he peered into the gloom, professional duty overriding self-preservation. The shadow moved again, this time unmistakably deliberate. Officer Chen's breath caught audibly as her flashlight captured something, a fleeting glimpse of movement that vanished almost instantly. "There's someone there," she stammered, voice barely audible over the commotion. The beam of light had briefly illuminated what appeared to be a human figure before it melted back into the shadows. Officer Dawson steadied his weapon, calling out with professional authority, This is the police. "Step out where we can see you, hands visible." Silence answered him, thick and oppressive, broken only by Ranger's continuous growling. Then, with deliberate slowness, a figure emerged from the shadows. Each step was unhurried, almost casual, as a man moved into the periphery of the flashlight's beam. He wore a hooded jacket that obscured most of his features, hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. Despite being confronted by armed officers, his body language conveyed neither fear nor concern, only a disturbing calm that seemed profoundly out of place. Ranger's growl transformed into something feral, primal, his claws scraping against the floor as Mason struggled to maintain his grip on the leash. "Identify yourself," Officer Dawson demanded. "Weapon trained, unwavering." The man did not immediately respond. Instead, he took another measured step forward, allowing the light to partially illuminate his face. A disconcerting smile played at the corners of his mouth, visible beneath the hood's shadow. Mason felt a surge of instinctive dread course through him. Something about this individual radiated wrongness, not just threat but a fundamental distortion of normal human behavior in a crisis situation. The man's composure in the face of armed officers and a highly trained military dog was profoundly unnatural. "Relax," the man finally spoke, his voice unnervingly soft and controlled. "I'm not here to harm anyone." The way he delivered those words, the cold, measured tone, the complete absence of appropriate emotional response, only intensified the atmosphere of wrongness. Mason knew instantly the man was lying. More importantly, Ranger knew it too, his growl deepening into a continuous warning rumble. An uneasy silence descended as the hooded figure stood at the threshold between hallway and courtroom, partially illuminated by Officer Chen's flashlight. The officers shifted their positions slightly, fingers tense on their triggers despite years of training in restraint. Mason's heart hammered painfully against his ribs, sweat beading on his palms as he maintained his grip on Ranger's leash. The German Shepherd remained in a state of high alert, muscles coiled, focused entirely on the stranger. The man tilted his head slightly, then took another deliberate step forward, drawing everyone's attention like a magnet. Ranger barked ferociously, nearly pulling Mason forward as the veteran tightened his grip on the leash, whispering, "Easy, Ranger, stay with me." His voice didn't carry over the nervous crowd, but Judge Hoffman caught his eye. Confusion and fear etched across his face. Officer Chen stepped closer to the figure, her flashlight beam steady now despite her obvious tension. "Sir," she began, voice remarkably steady given the circumstances, "I need you to identify yourself immediately." The man finally lifted his head, allowing more of his face to become visible. His eyes were cold and penetrating, sending an involuntary shiver through Mason's body. "I already told you," the stranger repeated with unnerving calm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Yet as he spoke, his hand moved toward his pocket, prompting both officers to shout warnings, demanding he stop and show his hands. The stranger paused, a slight smile curving his lips. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew a small metallic object that caught the light. A simple key. Yet there was no sense of relief in the room, only escalating dread. Ranger's barking intensified dramatically, confirming Mason's instinct that this key represented no reassurance. "It's not what it appears to be," Mason warned. his voice tight with certainty. "He is concealing something. He's concealing something." Ranger's reaction is unmistakable. The stranger's smile widened as if Mason's assessment amused him. Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on the gleaming key and the unsettling figure holding it. "Drop the key and step back," Officer Dawson commanded, his weapon unwavering. Officer Chen moved closer, her complexion ashen despite her professional demeanor. The stranger appeared completely unfazed by the situation. He cocked his head toward Ranger with apparent interest. "That dog is exceptional, isn't he?" he observed in a disturbingly conversational tone. "He always senses when something significant is about to happen. That's what made him so valuable during your deployments." Cold dread washed through Mason's veins. The stranger's knowledge of Ranger's abilities was specific, too specific for a random intruder. "How do you know about my dog? How do you know about my dog?" Mason demanded, voice trembling with a mixture of anger and apprehension. Ranger barked louder, lunging against the leash with renewed determination. The stranger's eyes gleamed with malevolent satisfaction. He slowly raised the key, the gesture seeming almost ceremonial in its deliberation. "You'll understand soon enough," he stated with chilling certainty. Then, with a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was slight, but the effect was immediate and dramatic. Ranger erupted into frenzied barking, more urgent than ever before. Before anyone could react, the courtroom lights flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. In that brief void of blackness, panic erupted. Gasps and cries echoed through the space. Chairs scraped against floors as people scrambled blindly. When the lights stuttered back to life seconds later, the situation had changed dramatically. The hooded stranger was no longer alone. Two additional figures had materialized from the hallway's shadows, their faces similarly obscured. Unlike their leader, however, they carried visible weapons, long metallic objects that gleamed menacingly in the unsteady light. Mason's heart thundered as he looked at Ranger, who was now growling with such intensity that it seemed to vibrate through the floor. Whatever was unfolding had escalated beyond a single mysterious intruder. This was coordinated, planned, and infinitely more dangerous. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. People rushed toward exits, voices raised in alarm, chairs toppling in their haste. The two newcomers advanced further into the room, triggering fresh waves of panic wherever they moved. Through it all, Ranger never ceased his warnings, his body lowered into a defensive stance, prepared to protect Mason at any cost. Mason tightened his grip on the leash, blood pounding in his ears, as realization struck with brutal clarity. The stranger wasn't here for random violence or a theft. He wanted Ranger. That was the purpose behind this orchestrated intrusion. Everyone remained calm, Judge Hoffman shouted, pounding his gavel ineffectually against the rising tide of hysteria. His voice was barely audible above the commotion. Officer Dawson regained his composure, flashlight beam fixed steadily on the intruders. "Stop right there," he ordered with renewed authority. "Drop your weapons immediately." The hooded leader paid no attention to the command, instead taking another measured step forward. His calmness amid the chaos was perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire scenario, setting Mason's every nerve on edge. At last, the stranger spoke again, his voice cutting through the din with unnatural clarity. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." The words were simple, but delivered with such cold certainty that they sent a wave of revulsion through Mason. Ranger growled continuously, his gaze fixed unwavering on the hooded figure. Mason's heart pounded painfully against his ribs, but when he spoke, his voice carried all the resolve and determination forged through years of combat and survival. "You're not taking him," Mason stated firmly, rolling his wheelchair closer to Ranger while maintaining his grip on the leash. He's more than just a dog. He's more my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what authority you think you possess. Ranger stays with me. For a moment, the entire room seemed to still, the chaos temporarily suspended. The stranger's smug expression faltered slightly, annoyance flickering across what was visible of his face. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult," he said, his gaze shifting between Mason and Ranger. "He's special. Holding him back only limits his potential. We understand his capabilities in ways you can't comprehend." Mason's grip on the leash tightened further, knuckles whitening with the force of his determination. "Ranger, stay with me," he commanded, voice firm and unwavering. Around them, spectators continued their efforts to distance themselves from the confrontation, some pressing toward exits, while others remained frozen, watching the scene unfold with horrified fascination. Ranger barked once more, the sound jolting through the room like an electric current. His focus on the stranger remained absolute. He understood precisely what was at stake in this confrontation. Mason's chest tightened as he leaned forward in his wheelchair, prepared to defend the one being who had never abandoned him, regardless of the cost. Whatever the stranger's motives or resources, one fact remained certain: Ranger wouldn't be leaving his side. And this dangerous standoff was far from its conclusion. An impossibly dense silence settled over the courtroom, broken only by Ranger's continuous warning growl. The hooded stranger stared at Ranger, and Ranger stared back, neither willing to break the visual confrontation. Mason clenched the leash with both hands, meeting the stranger's gaze with unflinching defiance. Behind the lead intruder, his two armed companions remained motionless, neither advancing further nor retreating, their weapons still visible but held at neutral positions. Judge Hoffman finally broke the oppressive silence, clearing his throat and forcing authority into his voice, despite his evident fear. "You have disrupted official court proceedings," he declared, addressing the hooded figure. "This ends now. Officers, escort these individuals out immediately." His words, though delivered with a tremor, reignited the tension. Officers Dawson and Chen advanced cautiously, weapons still drawn. Ranger barked once more, teeth bared as his eyes tracked every subtle movement the stranger made. The hooded man raised his hand in a placating gesture toward his companions. His expression shifted from anger to a calculated resignation that seemed more theatrical than genuine. "This isn't over," he stated, his voice carrying ominous certainty. "You think this is merely about acquiring a dog, but the reality extends far beyond your understanding. You'll comprehend soon enough." He took a step backward, the unsettling smile returning to his face. "For now, I'll withdraw, but that dog belongs with us. We will return." Mason's chest tightened with protective determination, the leash still taut in his hands. "Ranger belongs to no one but himself," he declared, voice steady and resolute. "And he chooses to stay with me. If you want him, you'll have to go through both of us." For the first time, the stranger displayed a genuine reaction. A slight flinch, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed Mason with cold calculation. Then, without another word, he turned and gestured for his companions to follow. The tension remained unbroken until they disappeared through the doorway they had entered, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Gradually, people returned to their seats, whispering among themselves as they attempted to process what had just transpired. Judge Hoffman exhaled heavily, placing his gavel down with visibly shaking hands. "This hearing is adjourned," he announced wearily, his voice nearly lost in the persistent murmurs filling the room. Mason remained where he was, eyes fixed on the doorway. Ranger finally sat, his growls subsiding though his posture remained vigilant. Mason reached out to gently stroke the German shepherd's head. "Well done, partner," he murmured. voice thick with gratitude and lingering adrenaline. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Mason stayed in place, thoughts racing through his mind. He had no idea who the hooded man was, or why he specifically wanted Ranger. Only that this confrontation was far from concluded. But as Ranger leaned reassuringly against his leg, Mason allowed himself the smallest moment of relief. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together. Their bond had been forged in fire, tested through trauma, and strengthened by mutual trust. It was unbreakable, and that was something no stranger, no matter how threatening, could ever take away. 2 weeks later, Mason sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Ranger lay beside his wheelchair, head resting contentedly on his paws. The events in the courtroom had changed everything. After Ranger's extraordinary demonstration of his detection abilities and the mysterious intrusion that followed, the Army had withdrawn their reassignment order. Judge Hoffman had ruled definitively that Ranger should remain with Mason, citing their exceptional bond and mutual dependence as primary factors in his decision. The identities of the intruders remained unknown. Despite extensive investigation, no surveillance footage had captured their faces, and their fingerprints weren't in any database. They had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, though Mason remained vigilant, knowing their promise to return could materialize at any moment. Mason reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ears, smiling as the German Shepherd leaned into his touch with contented familiarity. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" he murmured. From their first meeting at the training facility in Texas, through deployments across hostile territories, to Ranger pulling him from the wreckage after the explosion that had cost Mason his legs, their journey together had been extraordinary. And now, after the courtroom incident, their bond had been officially recognized as something worth preserving. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the horizon, Mason reflected on everything Ranger had taught him about courage, loyalty, and the profound connection that can exist between species. In the military, they had called Ranger an asset, but he was infinitely more. A sentient being with intelligence, empathy, and a capacity for devotion that many humans would struggle to match. The true value of Ranger couldn't be measured in military terms or quantified in training reports. It existed in the moments between heartbeats, in the way he instinctively positioned himself between Mason and strangers, how he gently woke Mason from nightmares with gentle nudges, his uncanny ability to sense Mason's mood shifts before they fully manifested. In saving Ranger from reassignment and from the mysterious figures who had infiltrated the courtroom, Mason had also saved himself. Without Ranger, the darkness that sometimes threatened to consume him would have no counterbalance, no living embodiment of hope and purpose sharing his space. The deeper truth, Mason realized as he watched Ranger's chest rise and fall in peaceful rhythm, was that saving goes both ways. Ranger had saved his life physically in combat zones and emotionally in the battlefield of recovery. Mason had saved Ranger from being treated as equipment rather than a living, feeling creature deserving of care and connection. This mutual salvation formed the foundation of something profound, a bond that transcended conventional relationships, crossing the boundaries between species to create something unique and precious. It reminded Mason that sometimes the most meaningful connections come in unexpected forms, teaching us that love and loyalty aren't constrained by our differences, but enhanced by them. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mason made a silent promise to Ranger, the same promise he had made in the chaotic aftermath of the explosion that had changed their lives. They would continue to protect each other, to find meaning in each day together, to face whatever challenges emerged with the same courage and determination that had brought them this far. Whatever threat the hooded stranger represented would eventually return, Mason had no doubts about that. But when it did, they would face it together as they had faced everything else. Two souls connected by experience, trust, and an unbreakable bond that defied simple explanation. The story of Mason and Ranger reminds us of several profound truths about the relationships between humans and animals. First, it illustrates that true bonds transcend conventional relationships. They cross boundaries of language, species, and understanding to create connections based on mutual trust and respect. Ranger's intuitive understanding of Mason's needs and Mason's unwavering commitment to Ranger's well-being exemplify a partnership of equals despite their obvious differences. Second, their story highlights the healing power of companionship. Mason's physical wounds from combat were visible in his wheelchair, but his deepest injuries were invisible. The psychological trauma of war, the struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, the challenge of finding purpose after injury. Ranger provided not just practical assistance, but emotional anchoring. A constant reminder that Mason was needed, valued, and understood. Third, we see the importance of recognizing the sentience and dignity of animals. The legal system's initial classification of Ranger as government property reflects a broader societal tendency to commodify animals, reducing them to their utility, rather than recognizing their intrinsic worth. Mason's fight was fundamentally about securing recognition for Ranger as more than equipment, as a being with needs, feelings, and the right to maintain connections that contribute to his well-being. Fourth, their story demonstrates how interspecies relationships can reveal our own humanity. In fighting for Ranger, Mason rediscovered aspects of himself that combat and injury had threatened to destroy. His capacity for fierce loyalty, his willingness to stand against authority when ethical principles are at stake, his ability to love unconditionally. Through Ranger's eyes, Mason could see himself not as broken or diminished, but as whole, worthy, and essential. Finally, Mason and Ranger's journey reminds us that true courage often manifests in the quiet, consistent choice to show up for those who depend on us. Ranger's bravery wasn't limited to battlefield heroics. It appeared each morning when he gently roused Mason from nightmares. Each time, he positioned himself to make Mason feel secure in public spaces. Each moment he intuited and responded to needs Mason himself might not have recognized. Similarly, Mason's courage wasn't just in combat, but in his daily commitment to ensuring Ranger received the recognition and protection he deserved. In a world that often emphasizes independence and self-sufficiency, their story celebrates interdependence. The beautiful reality that we are strongest not when standing alone, but when supporting and being supported by others, even those very different from ourselves. Perhaps most importantly, the bond between Mason and Ranger challenges us to look beyond superficial differences, to recognize the profound connections possible between all living beings. It invites us to consider how our own lives might be enriched by deeper, more respectful relationships with the animals who share our world, and to recognize that sometimes the most profound lessons about humanity come from those who aren't human all. Have you ever experienced a special connection with an animal that changed your perspective or helped you through difficult times? The bond between humans and animals can be transformative, offering unconditional love and support when we need it most. Thank you for joining me for this story about Ranger and Mason. If you have your own experiences with remarkable animals, please share them in the comments below. Each story of human-animal connection reminds us of the extraordinary bonds that can form between species. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more like it, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating content that celebrates the remarkable relationships between humans and their animal companions.